"This clause is a setup," said the Black Maid. The Mafia Boss lost his smile. "Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to Evelyn Brooks. She moved quietly across the polished hardwood floor, the soft hum of the climate control set to 72 degrees filling the office with a steady calm that felt rehearsed, intentional, and expensive. Evelyn had learned to measure rooms by details most people ignored. The weight of silence, the smell of leather-bound books, the way sunlight cut through floor-to-ceiling windows at exactly 4 in the afternoon. At 5 feet 6 inches, dressed in a plain gray uniform, she blended into the background the way she always had, her presence designed to be unnoticed, her steps measured, her eyes trained to look down. The office belonged to Richard Callahan, a man whose name carried more authority than the steel safe embedded behind the wall, a white man with carefully trimmed silver at his temples and a smile that usually meant he was already 10 steps ahead of everyone else. On the desk lay a stack of documents arranged with surgical precision, margins aligned, corners sharp, the top page slightly out of place as if someone had flipped it moments ago. Evelyn wiped the edge of the desk in slow, even strokes, the cloth warm in her hand, when her eyes caught a familiar pattern of language on the page, a sequence of words that made her breath pause for half a second. She did not intend to read, never did, but some sentences carried a gravity that pulled at memory the way a sudden drop pulls at the stomach. Her fingers stilled. The clause was short, polite, wrapped in professional phrasing, but she recognized the architecture immediately, the way one sentence leaned on another, the way responsibility shifted without announcing itself. She had seen it before, years ago, in a life that no longer existed, and the recognition came not with panic but with clarity. Evelyn spoke before. She could stop herself, her voice low, respectful, almost apologetic, as if commenting on the weather. "This clause is a setup." The words floated briefly in the air, light and unassuming, yet heavy enough to alter the room. Richard Callahan looked up slowly, his expression amused rather than offended, the corner of his mouth lifting in a practiced half-smile. He studied her the way one studies an unexpected sound, curious but unconcerned, confident the explanation would end in dismissal. Evelyn kept her eyes steady on the document, not on him, her posture unchanged, her tone free of accusation. She felt the familiar balance return, the one that came when truth mattered more than consequence. Outside the window, traffic moved in measured lines, horns muted by glass designed to keep the world out, while inside, something subtle had shifted, not loudly, not visibly, but enough to be felt. Richard reached for the paper, the smile still present, unaware that it had already begun to fade. Richard Callahan did not raise his voice, did not lean back, did not display irritation, and that alone defined the imbalance in the room more clearly than any gesture could have. He remained seated behind the desk, shoulders relaxed, fingers resting lightly on the edge of the paper, the kind of posture that belonged to someone accustomed to being deferred to without asking. Evelyn Brooks stood a few feet away, cloth folded neatly in her hands, waiting without expectation, without fear visible on her face, but fully aware of the distance between their worlds. This office was not merely a workspace. It was a controlled environment where decisions carried weight beyond numbers, where contracts shaped futures that never appeared on balance sheets. Richard was known for his attention to detail, for understanding leverage the way others understood weather patterns, predictable only if you knew how to read the signs. People came into this room to ask for permission, not to offer unsolicited opinions, and certainly not to correct him. He glanced down at the document again, more out of habit than concern, the faint smile still present, signaling that the interruption had amused him rather than unsettled him. Evelyn had been in this house for 8 months, long enough to learn the rhythm of power, long enough to know when silence was expected and when it was safest. She was hired to clean, to move through spaces quietly, to exist without leaving an impression, and she had done that perfectly. Staff members rarely remembered her name. and Richard himself had never spoken it aloud. She understood that invisibility was not accidental here. It was a requirement. The contracts on his desk were drafted by people who billed by the hour and spoke in conference rooms, people who wore confidence like tailored suits. The assumption was simple. A maid did not read legal language, and even if she did, she would not recognize intent. Richard's eyes flicked up to her again, measuring her reaction, waiting for nervousness or retreat, expecting the moment to dissolve. He saw none. Evelyn's posture remained steady, her gaze lowered but not submissive, her expression neutral in a way that came from discipline rather than ignorance. The silence stretched just long enough to test boundaries. Outside the office, the house continued its quiet routine, footsteps muffled by thick carpeting, clocks ticking softly in distant rooms. Inside, the hierarchy was unmistakable. Richard had built his reputation on control, on never being surprised, on knowing exactly who was in the room and why. Evelyn represented none of those categories, and yet the room felt marginally different, not louder, not tense, simply altered. He adjusted the paper slightly, aligning it again with the stack, an unconscious gesture that betrayed his instinct to restore order. Evelyn waited, aware that speaking again would require intention, not impulse. She had already crossed an invisible line, one drawn by assumption rather than rule. Richard's smile lingered, but something beneath it had paused, as if a calculation had been delayed. Power, after all, thrived on predictability, and for the first time in a long while, something in this room had not followed the expected script. Evelyn Brooks felt the weight of the moment settle not in her chest, but in her hands, the familiar steadiness she relied on when memory pressed too close. She knew exactly what she had done, and she knew why she had done it, even as a quieter part of her asked whether silence would have been easier. For years, silence had been her shield, a practiced habit shaped by consequences that never announced themselves until it was too late. She had learned that rooms like this rewarded compliance and punished curiosity, that knowledge carried by the wrong person was often treated as a liability rather than a gift. As Richard Callahan examined the page again, Evelyn's thoughts moved elsewhere, back to a time when words on paper had dismantled a life with polite efficiency. She remembered how clauses could be written to sound reasonable, how responsibility could be transferred without consent, how a single sentence could close every door while appearing to open one. That memory did not come with anger anymore, only clarity, the kind that made patterns impossible to ignore. She stood still because movement would have betrayed uncertainty, and uncertainty invited dismissal. Richard had not asked her to explain, and she did not volunteer more, because this was not about convincing him. It was about acknowledging reality. The imbalance between them was undeniable, reinforced by wealth, reputation, and the simple fact that his name commanded attention while hers was designed to disappear. Evelyn understood that her presence here was conditional, tolerated only because it did not challenge the order of things. She also understood that stepping back now would return everything to normal, that the moment would be dismissed as a curiosity, a harmless comment from someone who did not know better. That was precisely why she did not move. She had spent years retraining herself to recognize the point of no return, the instant when truth mattered more than outcome. Richard's office was quiet enough that she could hear the subtle sound of paper shifting beneath his fingers, a controlled motion that suggested he was thinking, not reacting. He had built his career on foresight, on understanding leverage before it revealed itself, and yet this clause had been crafted by someone else, someone who assumed he would sign without question. Evelyn knew the type, the kind of confidence that came from believing power made one immune to manipulation. Her silence was not defiance. It was respect for precision. She waited because the proof was already there, embedded in language, patient and unyielding. The house around them continued to operate on schedule, heating vents cycling softly, distant doors opening and closing, a world functioning as if nothing had shifted. Inside the office, however, time felt suspended, stretched between expectation and realization. Evelyn thought about the version of herself that once believed preparation was enough, that knowledge alone could protect what mattered. That version had learned otherwise, had learned that timing was everything, that speaking too soon or too late carried equal risk. Now, she trusted instinct tempered by experience. Richard's faint smile lingered, but she noticed how his eyes moved more slowly across the page, how his focus narrowed. She did not need to see his expression to know the calculation had begun. For the first time since entering the room, Evelyn allowed herself a single steady breath, not of relief, but of resolve, understanding that whatever followed, the truth had already done its work. Evelyn Brooks spoke again only when the silence had done its work, when the room no longer felt like it was waiting for permission but for accuracy. She did not raise her voice, did not step forward, did not claim authority that was not hers. She simply angled her head slightly toward the document and said that the third sentence in the indemnification section did not apply equally to both parties. Her words were careful, chosen not to impress but to clarify, each one placed with intention. She explained that the obligation appeared mutual only on first reading, that the phrasing shifted responsibility through conditional language that activated only after a triggering event defined by the opposing party. She noted that the timeline referenced in the footnote created a window where liability could be reassigned without notice, and that the cross-reference cited a schedule that had not been included in the packet. Evelyn did not say this was illegal or unethical. She said it was deliberate. Richard Callahan listened without interruption, his eyes now fixed on the page, his posture unchanged but his attention unmistakably sharpened. The faint smile that had lingered since the beginning no longer reached his eyes, not because he was threatened, but because he was recalculating. Evelyn stopped speaking as soon as the point was made, understanding that anything more would dilute the precision. She did not offer opinion, did not recount her past, did not appeal to consequence. She let the language stand on its own. Richard reached for his reading glasses, a movement so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but Evelyn registered it immediately. He reread the section slowly, tracing the lines with his finger, his expression neutral, professional, unreadable. The room felt denser now, not tense, but focused, as if the air itself had been redirected toward the document. Outside, a lawn sprinkler clicked on and off somewhere in the distance, the ordinary sound contrasting with the significance of the moment. Richard turned the page, then turned it back, comparing sections, checking references, following the structure she had outlined. He did not acknowledge her verbally, did not ask how she knew, did not challenge her credibility. That restraint told Evelyn more than any reaction could have. He had built his reputation on control, and control required recognizing when something unexpected was nonetheless correct. The imbalance between them remained, but it had shifted subtly, no longer defined solely by status, but by information. Evelyn waited, her hands still, her breathing steady, aware that this was the point where many people would feel compelled to justify themselves. She resisted that impulse, trusting that clarity required no defense. Richard removed his glasses and set them on the desk, his gaze lingering on the margin where the language tightened. For a moment, the office seemed smaller, the polished surfaces less imposing, the hierarchy less rigid. He exhaled quietly, not in frustration, but in acknowledgement, and the absence of his smile became noticeable only then. It was not replaced by anger or disbelief, but by concentration, the expression of a man realizing that the advantage he assumed he held had been carefully undermined. Evelyn remained where she was, neither advancing nor retreating, allowing the truth to occupy the space between them. She understood that this was not a victory, not yet, but a recognition, and recognition was always the turning point. The document lay open between them, no longer a formality, but a map revealing terrain that could not be ignored. Richard Callahan finally spoke, and when he did, his voice carried the calm curiosity of a man who preferred verification over concession. He asked Evelyn Brooks a question that sounded simple on the surface, framed as a clarification rather than a challenge, pointing to a subsection several pages earlier and asking how that language interacted with the indemnification clause she had referenced. It was a test, deliberate and measured, designed to determine whether her insight had been coincidence or comprehension. Evelyn did not answer immediately. She glanced at the section he indicated, noting the phrasing, the placement, the deliberate ambiguity that linked obligation to interpretation rather than action. She understood what he was doing and why. People like Richard did not accept information without pressure testing it, and respect in his world was earned through precision. Evelyn explained that the Subsection functioned as a shield only in isolation, that its protection dissolved once the triggering language in the later clause activated, effectively nullifying the safeguard while preserving the appearance of fairness. She spoke without embellishment, without urgency, her tone steady and factual, as if she were describing something inevitable rather than alarming. Richard listened, his attention fixed, his pen resting motionless between his fingers. He asked another question, this one more specific, about jurisdiction and enforcement, about whether the language could withstand scrutiny if contested. Evelyn replied that the language had been written to discourage challenge rather than survive it, that its strength relied on assumption and timing, not transparency. She noted that the cost of disputing it would outweigh the benefit for most parties, which was precisely why it had been structured that way. Richard nodded once, slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement that the answer aligned with the architecture he was now seeing. The room felt quieter, not because anyone had lowered their voice, but because the conversation had narrowed to substance alone. Evelyn remained aware of her position, of the fact that she was still standing in a place where she did not belong by design. But the questions continued, each one probing deeper, each one confirming that her understanding was not superficial. Richard asked where she had learned to read contracts this way, and Evelyn answered simply that experience had taught her what textbooks did not. She did not offer credentials, did not recount her history, did not seek validation. The answer was enough. Richard leaned back slightly, the first visible shift in his posture since the conversation began, his expression thoughtful rather than guarded. He turned back to the document, then to another, comparing language, tracing patterns, confirming connections. The test had served its purpose. What he saw now was not an anomaly, but a design, and the realization settled in quietly. Evelyn watched without comment, understanding that this was the moment where disbelief gave way to assessment. Richard was no longer evaluating her. He was evaluating the situation. The distinction mattered. He placed the pen down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the desk, a habit that signaled a decision point. The faint trace of amusement that had marked his demeanor earlier was gone, replaced by concentration that bordered on respect, though he did not name it as such. Evelyn felt the balance shift again, subtly but unmistakably, not toward equality, but toward recognition. The questions ceased, not because there were no more to ask, but because the answers were already present. In the stillness that followed, Richard's silence carried more weight than any dismissal could have, and Evelyn understood that the test had not been about proving herself, but about whether truth would be acknowledged when it arrived from an unexpected source. The questions stopped, not abruptly, but naturally, as if they had reached a point beyond which repetition would add nothing. Richard Callahan turned the document 90 degrees, then back again, scanning the margins he usually ignored, the places where intent liked to hide. He read more slowly now, not as an executive skimming for outcome, but as a reader dismantling structure, examining how one sentence leaned on another, how obligation was delayed, redirected, disguised. Evelyn Brooks did not speak. She understood that this was no longer a conversation. This was verification. Richard reached for a second folder from the stack, one related but separate, and opened it beside the first, aligning the pages so he could compare phrasing. The similarities were subtle, invisible to anyone not trained to see pattern, but once noticed, impossible to unsee. He followed the trail she had outlined without her prompting, tracing cross-references, checking definitions, noting where clarity dissolved into assumption. The room felt suspended, as though the rest of the house had receded, leaving only paper, ink, and consequence. Evelyn remained where she was, her hands relaxed at her sides now, her posture unchanged, her attention present but unobtrusive. She did not need to watch his face to know what he was finding. She had lived this discovery before, had watched others arrive at it too late. Richard exhaled through his nose, a controlled breath that carried no frustration, only recognition. He removed his watch and set it on the desk, an unconscious gesture that signaled focus, the outside world temporarily dismissed. He read again, this time marking a line with his pen, then another, his movements precise, economical. The faint authority that usually radiated from him was still there, but it had shifted inward, redirected toward understanding rather than dominance. Evelyn noticed how the air felt heavier, not with tension, but with gravity. This was the weight of realization, the kind that did not announce itself loudly, but altered decisions permanently. Richard paused, his pen hovering over the page, then stopped entirely. He did not look at Evelyn immediately. He sat back, eyes still on the document, as if acknowledging something that required adjustment rather than reaction. When he finally turned toward her, there was no smile to soften the moment, no irritation to mask it. His expression was composed, attentive, stripped of performative confidence. He asked one final question, not about the contract, but about timing, about when the clause would activate and who controlled that moment. Evelyn answered plainly that the opposing party controlled it entirely, that the language ensured they always moved first, always defined breach, always framed response. Richard nodded once, slowly, the motion deliberate. He did not challenge her answer. He did not counter it. He accepted it. The silence that followed was complete, not awkward, not strained, but settled, like a decision resting where it belonged. Evelyn felt no triumph, no relief, only a quiet confirmation that the truth had landed as intended. Richard closed the folder carefully, aligning it with the others, then placed his hand flat on top of the stack, as if grounding the moment. His jaw tightened briefly, not in anger, but in recalibration. The absence of his earlier smile was now unmistakable, not replaced by anything else, simply gone. In its place was something more restrained, more honest. Evelyn understood then that the balance had shifted as far as it was going to shift, not toward her, but toward reality. She remained silent, allowing that reality to occupy the space between them, knowing that proof did not need reinforcement once it had been seen. The document lay closed, but its implications remained open, and in that quiet office, the most powerful acknowledgement had already been made without a single word being spoken. Richard Callahan did not speak right away, and in that pause the room redefined itself around him. The desk, the folders, the quiet authority that usually framed every decision no longer felt performative but internal, as if the weight he carried had shifted from appearance to consequence. He stood slowly, not to intimidate or to reclaim space, but to change his angle of view, moving to the window and resting his hand lightly against the glass. Outside, the late afternoon light stretched across the lawn, steady and indifferent, a reminder that the world continued regardless of contracts signed or avoided. Evelyn Brooks remained still, her presence unobtrusive, aware that this moment was not about her explanation but about his acceptance. Richard looked out for several seconds longer than necessary, then turned back toward the desk, his expression measured, composed, absent of the familiar ease that had defined him earlier. He picked up the folder again, opened it, then closed it without reading, as if confirming that the knowledge no longer required repetition. When he spoke, his voice was even, thoughtful, stripped of ornament. He acknowledged that the structure was intentional and that the exposure was precise, and in that acknowledgement there was neither praise nor resentment, only clarity. He asked Evelyn whether she had noticed similar constructions elsewhere in the packet, not as a challenge, but as a continuation of analysis. She answered that the pattern repeated in smaller ways, subtle enough to avoid detection unless viewed together, and that the intent was consistency rather than concealment. Richard nodded, absorbing the implication that this was not an isolated risk, but a design choice. He returned to his chair, not hurried, not hesitant, and sat with his shoulders squared, the posture of someone recalibrating strategy. The absence of his earlier smile was now definitive, a change that did not need announcement. He set the folder aside, separating it from the others, creating a physical distinction that mirrored the mental one already made. The office felt quieter than before, not because the conversation had ended, but because it had resolved into certainty. Richard glanced at Evelyn again, this time not as an interruption or anomaly, but as a variable that had altered the equation. He asked her a final question about timing, about whether the clause could be neutralized through revision or whether its intent was too deeply embedded. Evelyn replied that revision was possible, but only if the language was rebuilt rather than patched, and that anything less would preserve the imbalance. Richard considered this, his jaw tightening briefly, then relaxing, the mark of a decision settling into place. He did not argue. He did not dismiss. He accepted the reality that had presented itself, and in doing so, accepted the cost of change. He stood again, this time with purpose, and moved the separated folder into a drawer, closing it firmly but without force. The action was quiet, decisive, final. Evelyn understood the significance immediately. This was not a delay or a negotiation. It was a refusal to proceed under false terms. Richard returned to his desk and met her gaze directly for the first time, not with dominance, but with assessment grounded in respect. He did not thank her. He did not apologize. He simply acknowledged that the outcome would have been different without her intervention. In that acknowledgement, the shift completed itself. The power in the room did not disappear, but it changed shape, no longer threatened by truth, but aligned with it. Evelyn felt no need to respond. The work she had done spoke for itself. The office returned to stillness, but it was a different stillness now, one defined by choice rather than assumption. Richard's smile did not return, and it did not need to. What remained was something more durable, a recognition earned not through position, but through precision. Richard Callahan remained by the desk, one hand resting on the closed drawer, the other relaxed at his side, as if grounding himself in a choice already made. The room had settled into a quiet that no longer felt provisional. After a moment, he asked Evelyn Brooks a question that had nothing to do with the document and everything to do with her. He asked where she had learned to read contracts the way she did. The question was not sharp, not suspicious, but deliberate, framed with the same precision he applied to every strategic decision. Evelyn considered her answer carefully, aware that this was not a request for a resume, but an opening, one that could redefine how she was seen. She said that she had once worked in an environment where documents decided outcomes before people realized they were involved, that she had learned the language because her livelihood depended on understanding it. She did not name the position, did not list credentials, did not describe success or failure. She stated only that she had learned the hard way what careful wording could conceal. Richard listened without interruption, his attention focused, his posture still. He asked when that chapter of her life had ended. Evelyn replied that it had not ended so much as been closed, that circumstances had narrowed her options, and that she had taken work that required reliability rather than recognition. She spoke without bitterness, without apology, presenting her past as context rather than justification. Richard nodded slowly, absorbing the implication that what stood before him was not untapped potential but redirected experience. He asked why she had not mentioned this before. Evelyn answered that she had not been asked and that the role she was hired for did not include advising on legal matters. The simplicity of the response underscored its truth. Richard exhaled quietly, the sound barely audible, as if acknowledging a miscalculation rather than a mistake. He walked back to his chair and sat, folding his hands briefly before separating them again, a gesture that suggested thought in motion. He told Evelyn that people often underestimated risk when it came packaged as familiarity, that they trusted appearances because appearances were comfortable. He paused, then added that comfort had nearly cost him leverage. The admission was understated but significant. Evelyn received it without reaction, understanding that recognition did not require response. Richard looked at her steadily, no longer assessing her place in the room, but her role in what had just been avoided. He asked whether she would be willing to review another document at a later time, not immediately, not as a demand, but as an option. Evelyn replied that she would consider it if asked formally and within the scope of her responsibilities. The boundary was clear, respectful, firm. Richard accepted it without objection. He stood again, this time signaling closure rather than transition, and thanked her, not effusively, but directly, using her name for the first time. The sound of it landed with quiet significance. Evelyn acknowledged the thanks with a nod, neither shrinking nor expanding the moment. As she turned to leave, the office felt different, not altered in its structure, but recalibrated in its assumptions. Richard watched her go, not as she disappeared back into the rhythm of the house, but as someone whose presence had left a measurable impact. When the door closed behind her, he returned to his desk, not to resume business as usual, but to reconsider what usual had meant. Evelyn walked down the hallway with the same steady pace she had always maintained, but inside, she recognized that something had shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but decisively. She had not reclaimed a former life, nor had she sought acknowledgement beyond what was necessary. She had simply allowed truth to surface where it mattered. And in doing so, she had altered the course of a decision that would have unfolded without her, proving that position did not define insight, and that clarity, once spoken, could not be unheard. The days that followed returned to their familiar rhythm, but the shift that had occurred did not fade with routine. Richard Callahan moved through his schedule with the same precision as before, meetings held, calls placed, decisions made. Yet one folder remained absent from circulation, sealed away without explanation. No announcement was made, no justification offered, and those who had prepared the documents were informed only that the direction had changed. The adjustment was quiet, deliberate, and irreversible. Evelyn Brooks continued her work as she always had, arriving on time, moving through rooms with practiced efficiency, her presence still understated, her demeanor unchanged. To anyone observing from a distance, nothing appeared different. But within the structure of the house, assumptions had shifted, and those shifts carried consequence. Richard noticed details he had previously overlooked, not only in language, but in people, in who spoke and who remained silent, in how certainty was often mistaken for accuracy. He did not summon Evelyn again immediately, nor did he alter her role publicly. Respect, in his world, did not announce itself. It manifested through restraint. Weeks later, when a revised document crossed his desk, rebuilt rather than amended, he reviewed it with care, noting the absence of hidden leverage, the balance restored through clarity. He approved it without hesitation. The choice confirmed what he had already accepted, that power untethered from truth was vulnerability disguised as strength. Evelyn sensed the change without being told. It appeared in small ways, in questions asked differently, in pauses where assumptions once lived. She did not seek acknowledgement, nor did she need it. The outcome had already spoken. One afternoon, as she finished her work near the office, Richard passed her in the hallway and inclined his head slightly, a gesture so subtle it could have been missed, yet deliberate enough to register. No words followed, and none were required. The recognition had already been made, not as favor or exception, but as correction. Evelyn understood that the justice of the moment did not lie in promotion or reward, but in prevention, in the quiet avoidance of harm that would never be traced back to her. The world often celebrated outcomes it could see, but this one would remain invisible, preserved only in altered paths and decisions. Never taken. As evening settled over the house, the lights dimmed gradually, controlled and consistent. Evelyn completed her tasks and prepared to leave. She paused briefly at the doorway, not to look back, but to acknowledge the stillness that now carried a different weight. Richard remained in his office, reviewing documents with a focus sharpened by humility, his earlier smile replaced by something steadier, more discerning. Neither of them spoke of what had occurred, because it did not require retelling. It existed in the space between certainty and correction, where dignity had been recognized without spectacle. The house returned to silence, not the silence of unchallenged authority, but the silence of alignment, where truth had found its place without force. And in that silence, something fundamental had been restored, not loudly, not publicly, but completely, reminding those who would never know the story that respect was not granted by position, but earned through the willingness to listen when it mattered most.